The people's champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans.
On September 6th, the Minister of National Security, Dr. Horace Chang, opened the debates on the Firearms Prohibition, Restrictions and Regulation Act 2022 in the lower house.
Right, and the act speaks to, among other things, a mandatory minimum sentence, life sentence that is, for illegal possession of firearm, and a mandatory 15-year sentence for other offences. And this is whether or not there has been injury caused with the person that has the possession.
The bill was passed by the lower house on September 7th and is scheduled to be debated on September 23 and 24th in the Senate. And following the debates, Jamaica will see the declaration of a gun amnesty, and the amnesty will allow for persons who may be in possession of an illegal firearm to surrender the weapon without charges being brought. Dr. Chang, interestingly, in his presentation, did acknowledge that there are different levels to gang involvement in terms of gang leaders versus youngsters who may be recruited by larger gangs. And he noted that the zones of special operations, for example, it has social interventions, which he hopes will address the issue of youths who are involved in gangs and criminal activities.
Well, in our submission to Parliament regarding the new Firearms Act, we would have outlined, Jamaicans for Justice would have outlined, among other things, our concerns about the mandatory minimum sentences, as they do not serve, based on our research, as a deterrent to crime, but they may place a very heavy burden on our already overburdened prison system. So,
all right, so with us to discuss the new firearms legislation is former Member of Parliament and Minister of Education, Reverend Ronald Thwaites, and Attorney at Law, Bert Samuels. Welcome, gentlemen. Do we have...
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, good afternoon.
yes, good afternoon.
Is this
Hi.
Reverend Thwaites?
Ronnie here.
Hi, good afternoon. And we have Bert Samuels with us as well. All right, we're not hearing Mr. Samuels, but Rev, it's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
And I'm Michael Jackson, and here with me is Jade Williams.
Thank you. Greetings to you both.
All right, so do you have any views on the proposed bill in terms of the implications for the mandatory minimum sentence?
You know, I have a memory.
Yes.
I was around when we had that sentence of indefinite detention for possession of a firearm and gun crimes in the 1970s, and it didn't work. The judges, quite correctly, don't like minimum sentences, or in that case, indefinite detention, which had many resemblances. And so they become very, very wary of conviction.
Yes.
Therefore, the aim that the legislators perceive is often defeated, apart from the fact that the minimum sentence is repugnant to the idea of judicial discretion, and, in my view, is immoral.
If I may ask, Minister, we had looked at the Criminal Justice Administration Act, and I think Dr. Chang and Mr. Golding would have also pointed out a section in the Act that is being touted as something that could help to restore the loss of judicial discretion in the current bill. Do you have any thoughts on that section? It's 42K in the Criminal Justice Administration Act.
Don't remember its terms right now, but that would be a left-handed approach, wouldn't it? Where you mandate something that you say is absolutely essential and appropriate, which is the government's position, and then you leave some kind of backdoor loophole for mitigating it. That's not how we should be approaching jurisprudence.
And just to clarify for the listeners, the section that Jade mentioned is really speaking to the possibility of an appeal, where if it is that the judge believes that the mandatory minimum sentence is unjust, then they can give the offender a leave
recommendation,
to appeal,
right. Yeah.
and then it will be up to the Court of Appeal to determine whether or not such appeal will be granted.
You ever heard the expression passing the buck?
But you know, Rev, one of our biggest concerns around that so-called safety valve, if you will, is the affordability issue. Who exactly will stand to benefit if such a backdoor deal is left? Do you have any views on that when you talk about vulnerability and social class and all of these things?
Well, thankfully, we have a much better legal aid system than when I began practice in 1970. So one presumes that there would be legal assistance for persons, the majority of whom come from a class that can't afford legal assistance to do all those things. But again, that's just a sop. Why don't we just be straightforward and recognize that we're not looking at the causes of crimes. We're not asking why people join gangs. We're not penetrating where the firearms come from and why people drudge them.
Yes.
And this is not to say that you don't have to have strong policing and strict legislation, but this is a panic reaction with a largely political motive.
Yes.
As it was in 1974, by the way.
Yes. And, you know, this is something I know Jade reminds us all the time of, that we need to clarify to persons that the issue with the Firearms Act goes much deeper and graver than we think. Because the mere possession of an illegal firearm means that someone will get an automatic life imprisonment sentence.
Yes.
So when we're talking about a mandatory minimum sentence, we're acting on the assumption that an appeal will automatically be granted after 15 years.
Not an appeal, a parole.
Parole, my apologies. Thanks, Jade.
Mm-hmm.
So from your lens, Rev, do you have any views on around, you know, the parole system and how those mechanisms work? Is it something that there's some surety of being given after 15 years when you think about a youngster, for example, who may be caught with an illegal firearm?
No, not at all. It's not certain. By the very nature and definition of parole, it is a consideration which is by no means automatically granted as to a person's suitability for release after a long period of incarceration. So that is very limited. You know, I remember the people who were locked up indefinitely for having a cartridge, you know.
Yes.
Right.
Which I believe is going to be similarly caught in as I read this legislation. We learn nothing from our past, ladies. We don't understand that the strong measures are indicated, no doubt, but that to do it this way is in fact to wreak an injustice. One, it is to violate the victim. Please don't let us I can hear the echoes of people saying, listen to these people forgetting the victim. We're not.
Yes.
We're asking for constructive, rehabilitative, as well as deterrent measures, and simply to sentence people for life. After probably 3 or 4 years in custody, because that's this legislation has to be seen in the context of the way the judicial system works or doesn't work.
Yes.
Yes, is not going to solve our problem.
All right. Thank you so much, Reb. We actually have
Mr. Samuels.
Mr. Bert Samuels on the line with us. Welcome, Mr. Samuels.
Yeah, may I apologize. I had connection problems.
That's not a problem. Thank you very much for joining us. But you've joined us at right now. We're about to go for a short break. So if you could just stay online and we will come back to you right after the break. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. I am Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Officer at Jamaicans for Justice. And with me is Mikel Jackson. And also with us is Mr. Bert Samuels, Attorney at Law. And right now we're discussing the new firearms bill. So, Mr. Samuels, are you here?
Yes, I'm with you.
And still with us is Reverend Thwaites, of course.
Great. So, Mr. Samuels, we had a long discussion with Reverend Thwaites before you were able to join us, and we spoke about some of the implications of mandatory minimum sentences. But what I'd like to pick your brain about is about the omission of issues related to the planting of firearms in the bill. Having read it thoroughly, we have seen no mention of what we would consider to be a major issue involving corruption that has not been mentioned. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting that you have said that, because I've always said that when you're going to make draconian legislation, then you have to have, legislation accompanying that makes it harsh punishment for those who seek to, as you've said, plant evidence on persons. And I've had experience in the court. There's a David Clark matter, which is a matter of record in the press, where his ammunition was planted on him, and it was proven to be so planted in the court because the member of the army who recovered the ammunition from the bushes at Riverton City was able to give a statement to the director of public prosecution that he recovered it from the bushes. Whereas the police officers from the Hunts Bay police station said that they went there, they were not there on the soldier's account, and saw the ammunition in the pocket of David Clark. So the case had to be thrown out. Now, I've followed through with this acquittal because it didn't end there for me. I wanted justice to be done across the board. And with the passage of 5 years, there has been no movement. The police officers remain in their job, no investigation. I engaged the public defender. I wrote to the DPP and the Commissioner of Police, repeating what happened in the trial, sending the statement of the soldier, which contradicted the police officers who I've said were not on the scene. They planted themselves on the scene. So there were two plants, planting themselves on the scene and planting the ammunition in the pocket of David Clark.
And just to say, this is something that we have seen documented by reports coming from JCF itself, Jade, as well as a 2018 Indicom report. So this is not just a single matter that Mr. Samuels is referring to. This is something that is systemic, and I think we have to acknowledge that, certainly.
And I think in the context of our conversation with Mr. Thwaites, we would have spoken about mandatory minimum sentences. What are the implications now with no provisions for planting, mandatory sentence of life imprisonment for possession? What are we looking at here in our legal landscape?
Yes, these mandatory sentences have this awful feature that nothing draconian is done to the persons who seek to cause people to be imprisoned, and it has been exposed. So this mandatory sentence issue is historically, it's been a problem for Jamaica. You recall before 1972, for possession of a spliff, you had a mandatory 6-month imprisonment period.
18 months.
18 months, thank you. Which had accompanying it when Rastafarians were taken to the prisons. They were trimmed so that the discrimination against Rastafari was heightened by this mandatory sentence, because it meant not only the person went to jail for a user amount of ganja, but was trimmed by the prison rules.
Oh, wow. So similarly, it has implications for persons based on social class and other.
That is it. It is aimed. So that the stigma, the anti-Rastafarian stigma that plagued the police force, which heightened in the Coral Gardens beating and persecution of Rastafari, that was a continuing situation in Jamaica. So that these mandatory sentences come to affect the certain social classes, as you have said.
Absolutely.
It's the young man in the ghetto who is going to be,
And as you say, young, I consider those children who are at risk, those children who are being influenced by gangs, Where do they fit into this landscape? Because I don't know how familiar you are with the bill, either of you, with the bill, but we would have seen where the implication is that we should use the Child Care and Protection Act as well as the
Gun Court.
Gun Court Act in order to deal with children under the Firearms Act. But what we've realized is that using those acts who have their own problems are not sufficient in protecting children who are vulnerable to
Jade is
certain
putting
gang
it
activity.
mildly. Under the Child Care and Protection Act, our youngsters can also be placed in prison for up to life. And for those who are age 12 and 13, you can get up to 25 years. So to you, Reverend, you sat in the chair of Ministry of Education, which would have addressed young people. Do you have any concerns around this?
Great concerns. First of all, let me greet Bert Samuels and thank him for his advocacy on the matter. We have to ask some fundamental questions. Apart from being distracted and distressed at the current level of violence and murderousness, what is attracting young children to so-called gangs? What is it in there that do we think we can get all of them into prison? Do we think that we're somehow going to be able to use these measures to cause some surcease in violence? It is amazing how blind the legislators are being. What about is this legislation being complemented by the attention to the atrocious living conditions of the majority of our people, the weak families, the encouragement of uncommitted sex as a prime exercise of personal freedom, the charade of equality in education, the exclusion of moral learning, the putrid ethic in our society that you must win at all costs and that money can get you anywhere?
Yes.
I mean, if you told me that you needed serious legal penalties in order to bring people together to ensure that they were into a matrix where they were being rehabilitated, retrained, resocialized mandatorily, then I begin to understand what you're trying to do. This is a classist thing. This puts Horace Chang, Andrew Holness, Marlene, whatever lady, on the side of Governor Eyre and Baron von Kettleholt rather than on the side of Bogle, Sharp, and Gordon.
Those are strong words, Rev.
Yes.
But
Yes, they are.
we're coming up on to end the interview. What is your last word, starting with you, Rev, and then to Mr. Samuels, to the Senate, who will be meeting to review the bill? What would you urge them to do?
Discernment and courage, and could they please shed the two things? One, the knee-jerk party loyalty on the one hand, and two, just this very palpable, understandable fear of the moment, and look at fundamental causes.
To you, Mr. Samuels, you're urging to the Senate, and then we take.
My urging to the Senate is that they should trust our judges. Judges should be given the latitude and the discretion to impose the appropriate sentence. The Constitution is not arranged in such a way that the Parliament passes sentence, and that's virtually what's happening.
Yes.
We have marginalized our judges who can get social inquiry reports and pass the appropriate sentences in the appropriate circumstances.
All
Thank
right.
you very, very much for both of your contributions. We'd just like to say
Thank you. And again, just to recap, that's Reverend Ronnie Thwaites, who is a former MP and minister, as well as Mr. Bert Samuels, attorney at law. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for joining us.
welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. If you are just joining us, you would have missed a very engaging and informative conversation with Reverend Ronnie Thwaites and attorney at law Bert Samuels. We thank them again for their contribution. We were here discussing the Firearms Act and the implications that it may have should it be passed as is for our citizens. I would just like to remind those of us who are listening that you can call in and share your views on what was discussed. You can call the studio line here at 876-676-4996, or you can send us a WhatsApp message at 876-239-7583. And so, some of us would have been sharing our views for the past week on our Instagram pages, on our public view poll. Mikkel, can you share some of that information with us?
All right, so thanks, Jade. The question that was asked to persons: what are your views on the mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years to life imprisonment for illegal possession of firearms and other offenses? And the views varied. Persons did call us as well to ventilate some of their concerns, but let us read a few. Person said, sounds good to me, or sounds great to me. I guess that individual is agreeing with the mandatory minimum sentence. We will hope to change that person's views in a short while.
Absolutely.
There was one that I liked, but I will have you go read another, and then I get to that one in particular.
Oh, well, one of our commentators said it seems extremely long, knowing that this is going to predominantly affect young men, a point that Reverend Thwaites and Mr. Samuels would have articulated as well in our discussion.
Yes.
And also, where are the guns coming from? An important point for us to be able to determine and to really address this firearm issue.
So there is this one from Croward, J.M., and he quotes Sir Thomas More's Utopia, a book that I read in my early years. For if you suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners to be corrupted from their infancy, and then punish them for those crimes to which their first education disposed them, what else is to be concluded from this, but that first you make thieves and then you punish them?
Wow.
And it is such a profound statement.
Yes.
So to break it down, our education system has failed individuals, especially those from the inner city communities, the low-income communities.
Mm-hmm.
This mandatory minimum sentence, debatably so, but based on history in Jamaica and certainly other jurisdictions, you see wherein this particular law stands the possibility of criminalizing persons. So you go in the prison systems, Jade and listeners, as low-level offenders, and then you
come out as a mastermind.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So,
and with that, we'll go into our first caller.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. So I was listening into the discussion earlier. I find it very interesting. But I mean, so I'm a bit torn on many of the issues that are being discussed, but I do think that it needs to come with a lot of nuance. Because the first thing that I want to recognize is that the government is trying to solve a real problem.
Absolutely.
And a problem that is growing and a problem that's affecting people very strongly. In fact, we're one of the most murderous countries in the world. So when you're trying to solve an issue that big with so few resources, you have to look at everything that's available to you and then take action, right? So one of the first things I'd like to do before I begin my longer comments is just to make a distinction between like the specific bill that's being discussed to introduce mandatory minimums and the issues that exist in the social landscape that definitely need to be fixed in the like solution to crime, right? Because while those issues do contribute to crime and while they do need to be fixed, they're not mutually exclusive to the proposal that's currently on the floor, right? And I think one of the biggest frustrations that has been expressed over the past couple of months and couple of years is where people commit really egregious crimes. They're involved in all kinds of criminality. They're found guilty, but then they're treated in a way that's viewed as being very lenient in the eyes of the general Jamaican public. And when this treatment is given to criminals and the general, public doesn't understand what's going on, it leads to a sense of frustration in the criminal justice system, which then results in a moment like this.
If I may, I would
Yeah.
say that the factors that you would have said are not mutually exclusive to the issues being addressed in the bill are the factors that would reduce the frustration, where persons feel as though persons aren't being adequately punished. Because I think one of the reasons that perception continues is that the crime rate has not gone down despite the measures that we have been taking. So I think that we have to consider whether or not increasing penalties and adding penalties is really going to be what is a long-term and effective solution. And I think when we had the discussion earlier, both Reverend Thwaites and Mr. Samuels would have indicated that what we really need is a holistic approach, because the way how we've been thinking about it, trying to isolate the violence from the social issues, it's not effective. And at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that a lot of social issues do drive violence. And so before we are able to before we are able to say that a harsher penalty is a more effective way to do this, I think we haven't adequately explored the social issues and how much effect they are actually having on the rate of crime here.
And whether or not we've given JCF the resources to actually do intelligence-based policing, to actually catch the criminals, and then to see greater levels of conviction based on the evidence before them. Because whether or not you have harsher penalties in place, if you're not catching anybody, then it makes for naught, yeah?
Right, so that's a part of the holistic solution, right? So we can pursue those social investments, we can resource police better, but there is still that case where a case might be prepared, someone is found guilty, they're sentenced to 2 years, and then the people in the communities who testified against them are now up against them 2 years later. Right, so there also needs to be an assessment of what goes on. And one of the things that I've been paying close attention to is the sentencing guidelines that's used by the judges, right? That's developed within our system. It's something that we have control over in terms of, the judiciary in Jamaica. It's not something that's like constitutionally entrenched deeply. It's not something that's impossible to change. And every time frustration is expressed about the kinds of sentences that are being meted out. I remember a particular case, a young boy, was mutilated and was assaulted, and the person who did it, I think got sentenced for less than 5 years, right? So when frustrations are expressed about that, the response cannot be, well, the sentencing guidelines are there and that's what judges are following, so because of that, we can't do anything to solve the problem, and then we move on.
Yeah, but we have to look at judicial discretion in both ways, because what you're describing is the sentencing guidelines putting a limitation on judicial discretion, and that's the same thing that the Firearms Act is aiming to do. So I think we'll have the same effect, because one of the things that we would have seen with, for example, a mandatory minimum sentence in jurisdictions other than ours is that when they limit judicial discretion, judges instead don't convict. So what we won't have is greater levels of conviction and more deterrence. What we will have is judges feeling uncomfortable with the proportionality of sentence in comparison to the crime, and then they don't convict. So if we do that, I think, as I said, and as we would have been articulating, acknowledging all frustrations of persons, we still have to take it from a holistic standpoint in order to make a real effect. Otherwise, whatever effect we make will be limited, and it will not be the kind of holistic response that we would really expect. So I think we should really hold our government to that level of accountability to ensure that while they are doing their best to address what is a crisis issue, that they also seek the holistic response that will give us the long-term solution that we need.
All right. Thanks so much. We can take the next caller.
And then we'll go to our break.
All right. One of the things, Jade, before we get into the next caller, that we have mentioned, and in terms of the solution, we made reference to our urging to Parliament that even if they retain what we deem to be an injustice with a mandatory minimum sentence, what kind of judicial discretion can be reintegrated or actually placed, because it was never there in this particular piece of legislation. But for JFJ, we did make reference to the UK's sentencing guidelines. So if you could just educate the listeners on
Right,
that
so
proposal?
Simply put, the UK would have tried to do a tiered response to a crime issue, as a gun possession issue, while using mandatory minimum sentences, but constructed it in such a way that there were limitations to, one, increase the judicial discretion that's not normally associated with mandatory minimums.
Yes.
But also,
So if you're a first-time offender,
right,
young
so
person.
it gives it, like I said, it's a tiered response. So if you're a first-time offender, there is a specific sentence. If you are second-time or multiple offender, there's a specific sentence. Right, so there are several issues that would have come out in the UK Act that would have shown that there are more nuanced ways to introduce a mandatory minimum sentence.
Yes.
And as we would have articulated, I mean, while we do have a general stance against mandatory minimums, we do understand the government's need to balance the concerns of citizens. So we ask if they will continue to retain the mandatory minimum sentence, that we allow for certain levels of judicial discretion that are currently missing from the approach that we are going to use.
All right, so we're going to take a break, but just reminding persons that they can call 676-4996 and WhatsApp us at 239-7533. Okay, welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. You're with Jamaicans for Justice, and you're speaking to Michael Jackson and Jade Williams. And for today, we're focusing on the firearms bill. And we're urging Senate, of course, that as they deliberate on this important piece of legislation, that they ensure that all persons, especially the vulnerable groups, are appropriately catered for. And with us on the line is Chris. Chris, afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon, ladies. How are you?
We're doing well, thank you.
We're doing well, thank you.
Yes. I must say before I make my comment, thank you guys for having this discussion. It's really important, and it's a beautiful discussion thus far.
Great.
What I want to add, though, is that we have mentioned it through the program that one of the groups that will be significantly affected by the decision to have a mandatory minimum sentence in this regard is those at-risk youth. And the problem I want to also highlight is that what many Jamaicans and persons would take into consideration is that our prison system is not structured in a way to factor in these individuals and their rehabilitation to come back into society, nor does it take into consideration how it is that their human rights ought to be respected. And I'd like to turn your attention to the Department of Correctional Service report earlier this year highlighting many human rights violations that happen within these institutions and the lack of a well-structured rehabilitation program and educational system. And if that's the reality, then if we have a legislation in this manner that puts all these young persons there, the issue with crime that we're having now is an issue that will be continuing to face even further down the line. And what the Parliament is currently doing then is creating a system that is attempting to fix a problem now, but not truly bringing any resolution to the problem, especially in the future.
Yes.
So that's my 2 cents on the matter.
And before you leave, one of the things, and thanks so much, Chris, you made mention of the Department of Correctional Services report. For those who are not aware of the implications of that report, you have youngsters who were, for example, incarcerated, because we're not going to be prettying up in the language here, on the basis of being uncontrollable for petty crime, and they are locked up by the state. The educational provisions were so poor to the point where the teachers did not stay because of wage issues, to the point where the disciplinary measures were questionable in a number of these juvenile detention centers. So you're talking about the state itself committing acts of violence towards our youngsters. And by the way, this is in the juvenile system. What can you expect when these persons, our youngsters, then go to prison, into adult facilities? How will they be treated? Again, I go back to the quote from Thomas More that the person expressed their opinion on, commented on, that at first you make thieves, in this instance, criminals of our youngsters, and expect that they're going to come out on the other side better human beings. It's unfortunate. All right, we have the other caller as the person. We're losing them. Oh, the call isn't working at the moment. So, Jade, one of the things, again, I want us to go back to the submission that JFJ made. We also saw some incongruence in the sections, So, let's be tough on crime, but the sections in Jamaican language, they don't make no sense.
Well,
Section 5, 14, 15, if you remember what they mean, you're remembering off the top of your head?
Well, Section 5 is always fresh in my memory because you know that is my major issue with mandatory minimum sentences.
We have the caller, but just quickly, just tell us how the different sections just to make the sense.
Well, the issue is that if it allows for the police to have a discretion that we've never seen the police have before, at least not in my research.
So it's shifting from judicial discretion to
police discretion,
because the police will do what?
The police are going to decide what to charge you with.
So it's either a charge for illegal possession of firearm for you to get the life imprisonment,
or I charge you for having the possession of firearm with intent, or possession of firearm that was actually used in a felony. So it's like 3 different offenses, 3 different mandatory minimum sentences, the maximum one being for mere possession with no use. So if you and a police officer have a little altercation and he decides to charge you within the context of that, so you have a firearm on you, illegal firearm, and he decides to charge you within that context, he could make his pick.
And good police officer will say the laws are unjust, so therefore let me choose the lesser offense, and someone who lacks a little bit of integrity may very well open to the possibility of corruption. But anyway, who's the caller we have? Jerome?
Hello, hi.
Yes. Hi, Jerome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, ladies.
Good afternoon.
First, I want to start by saying I saw your tweet this morning.
Which one is that? I've been tweeting since 6 o'clock in the morning.
Sorry, the one where you tweeted about the person saying you should have died in the shooting.
Yes.
I must say that is very unfortunate, and that speaks to the minds of our young people and the people in our environment. But what I'm talking about, I want to talk about is Dr. Chang's comments. Because I have mixed views on that. Because on one hand, I get what he's saying, but on the other hand, I can see how it's problematic. Because one, when someone attacks the police, and I saw your argument, and I get it, you guys are saying police should defend themselves, but the aspect where Dr. Chang says they're not sending any ambulance for them and stuff like that, where he's saying it is costing the state $10 million to save someone's life, when that resource could be used, how I interpret it, that resource could be used to save someone else who is not a troublemaker. When you think about it on the high crime rate, imagine walking down, somebody gun you down, and for only you to shoot them, and then they take them to the hospital, and then they come back around a few years later, or months, come back for you, or to rob someone else. What I'm saying is, I think some persons are beyond reform. I am not judge and I'm not jury, but I think some persons are beyond reform. What about those persons?
What I would say is, one of the problems that we have is that we don't try reform. So when we say persons are beyond reform, we're basing that on whatever action they would have took. But that action is as a result of their existence in the society out here with us.
It just not happened at the justice system in Jamaica.
Right. We have never tried to reform anyone. So I think we can't say that there are persons that are beyond reform based on their actions. Because I think one of the gaps that we have in trying to understand criminality is, why are these crimes taking place? If, for example, we've had several high-profile killings happen over the past couple of months, and we would have, of course, had an emotional response where we want to see punishment in the law. But what we never considered was, why did these things happen? Because at the end of the day, when we punish this one, what is preventing another person from doing the same thing? And if you're going to tell me it's the punishment, that's clearly not the case, because we would have been punishing these persons quite harshly.
And Jade, the issue is, even if someone is beyond reform, it cannot be the response of someone who is a medical doctor, the Minister of National Security, and you see me going up in stages now, and the Deputy Prime Minister, who is going to be publicly stating that you leave someone to die, the implications are far too great. So you better not be a victim of gunshot wound and look a particular way that you can be discriminated against. Because anyhow you go to a public health facility, based on instructions of Dr. Chang, perhaps you would not be treated. And the other thing, kudos to Dr. Chang for arguing and making a statement that persons should see some social interventions. From JFJ's standpoint, we have yet to see what those social interventions are and get the costing for those. So we'll see. But another 30 seconds for you just to indicate what else you have to tell us.
Yes, and the other, and I was talking about at the same time, some of these police officers who are out there who Dr. Chang is giving the order to shoot to kill, some of these police officers themselves are corrupt. So when Dr. Chang is equipping the police to go ahead and shoot to kill, they themselves, the police force, needs to be reformed. In the core of the police right now is corrupt. A lot of young people don't trust most of the police because there are some police that young people trust. But for example, the case of Noah Maitland, there are other police officers who aren't earning, for example, over $2 million, but yet still they have a lot of resources. The car they're driving, the whole.
I want to caution though, the Noel Maitland case is still before the courts.
Yes.
You know, at JFJ can't take a lawsuit up in here, so let me just fix that statement completely where that is concerned. But we have to leave, Jerome. Thanks so much for calling. But one of the things we have to look at, Jade, and listeners generally, is how we are not emotive in certain things, really. And I wouldn't want the officers to be listening in and think that JFJ is saying that they're all corrupt, because we have always said that we stand with the good women and the good men of the police force. But it's the bad one, then we need to weed out completely who are causing the JCF to be in disrepute.
And even so, some of the things that we advocate for, they are in protection of the JCF. If you got a holistic understanding, it is in your protection to be able to defend yourself when accusations are made against you.
Hi, Jade, we're coming up on the time, but this is our very first week, and we're not radar practitioners. We did not go to Karamak. You're an attorney, and I'm a public policy personnel, so to speak. So how was it for you?
Excellent. It was a good discussion. Nervous.
Oh, Lordy. All right, go on with a big
I don't know what that is.
You don't know?
Never experienced that before.
Let's pretend. All right, cool. Anyway, thank you so much to our listeners, and thank you to Bridge 99 FM, and thank you to Open Society Foundation. JFJ, we stand ready to support and lend our assistance to anyone who calls in. And just reminding you of our campaign slogan, justice for one, justice for all. Until then, take care.